going to do is I'm going to give you a brief history of some political philosophy. And I have a point that I'm trying to make, which is not to say, learn all of these philosophers and what they said. It's sort of to make a point of how the whole transition across time is related to the logical goals of part one of this course. And then I'm going to give you some advice about how to pass exam one. On exam one, you're just going to be asked to categorize claims. It's going to be the same multiple choice question with 6 options of the different kinds of claims, and I'm going to make a claim and then you categorize it. Now, unlike most multiple choice tests, it's open note, open book, open internet, so you have all your notes, you can look back over everything, and also you can explain your answer for partial credit, or even full credit if I'm convinced. So that's kind of fun. We'll talk a little bit about logical fallacies if we get there, and some causal fallacies. Okay, all right, so let's get started. A brief history of political philosophy. The learning goal is to understand the role of causality and ethics in the history of political philosophy. And it's supposed to help you solidify your understanding of the difference between text interpretation, which is how we interpret what the philosophers mean, right? And causality, and the importance of causality and how that sort of came about, and normative ethics, where they're telling you what you should do, what you should believe. All right, so the learning goals that are not the learning goals is to memorize who said what. That is not necessary. This is just explaining the different kinds of logic employed. And not to believe what they say and not to believe what I say. All right. So I'm kind of basically have this goal that you learn to stay in your own logic lane. Once you've decided on a lane, you got to stay in it. You got to hold yourself accountable for staying in your lane and hold other people accountable, because as soon as you start to practice these skills, you're going to see that in life, political pundits, even very smart people, don't stay in their lane. They mix and match what kind of argument they're making, and then you're all confused, and then everybody's, turns out you're arguing over the definition of a word, and it's kind of irritating. So we can kind of sort of get to a place where you've got valid evidence when you're making a claim. So Socrates and Aristotle, a lot of people like to start with them because they were really interested in what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean for society to be just? And you kind of get to a point in the Republic, Plato's Republic, where it's like justice is minding your own business. And you're like, what? But anyway, the point is to know, they wanted to know what is great about humanity. Aristotle says that the highest aim of humanity is politics. Now, politics, even the word, has a little bit of a negative connotation, doesn't it? Oh, that's so political, right? It's got this negative connotation. Aristotle didn't think so, and I don't think so. It shouldn't be, right? So, but in any case, Aristotle wrote a whole book about the virtue of friendship and what it means to be a good friend. And that's kind of cool because I take friendship seriously, so it's kind of a neat thing. All right, so Aristotle bought Plato a bumper sticker for Christmas, and that was this: peace, love, and justice. But what you have to understand is that justice is not the same thing as cooperation, all right? That those two things sort of get laid out as being completely orthogonal to one another. Sometimes cooperation is just, sometimes it's not. So cooperation is not a virtue, and I just need to say this over and over again just so it gets into your head. Cooperation is not necessarily a virtue. We like to predict it in political science, but it doesn't mean that it's good necessarily. All right, it's not a virtue, not a virtue. All right, Socrates was put to death for corrupting the youth. You'll hear political pundits today who might feel kind of similarly to that. And the question is, why Thomas Hobbes, I'm sort of previewing here, would have signed his death warrant? And the question is, why is justice, the concept of justice, so dangerous? And that is something that we'll talk about. Cicero, I've got some words up here. You don't have to read the words. But Cicero was really interested in duty. Like, what does it mean? What do we owe one another? And we have aspects of the law in every legal system about attributing responsibility when you violated a code of what we owe one another. And so he was focused on that. So one of the first Christian philosophers, or maybe even the first Christian philosopher, said that you should never punish people for evil. There should be no worldly punishments. And so that's kind of an interesting take, because later on, Thomas Aquinas said the exact opposite, and so and wanted to punish that. And sometimes you see that in politics today, that people are kind of looking for ways to punish people for violating, rules about vice and virtue, right? All right, so then evil arrives in philosophy land. Can anyone guess? Machiavelli comes around, and he says some crazy things like, if you injure somebody, make sure you kill them so they can't, get you back. And he gives advice about how to gain power. But I kind of like to focus on Thomas Hobbes, who says some very controversial things, but he also says some things that are at least worth entertaining for a moment, okay? He says, justice, there is no such thing. And I think he means it really, but he also means if I say I really want society to be just, do you know what I'm talking about? You have no idea, right? You have no idea what I mean by that. We could put a bunch of labels on it. If I call it justice, it's almost like a nonsense word because it doesn't communicate anything, right? And so he says, therefore, what we need, humanity's salvation, is the law. And part of the point of this entire part one of the course is to talk about there's a big difference between what the law is and what is just, right? I have a friend who, he asked his parents, he was like, why did you always spank my brother, but you never spanked me? And their answer was, because it wouldn't work. That's what they said. Like, parents can kind of figure out, this is going to work with this kid, but not going to work with the other kid. The legal system can't do that, right? The legal system treats everyone equally under the law at best. And even that doesn't really achieve justice necessarily. I mean, there's a class that's offered called the justice system. I'm like, I'll teach that, but you got to rename it because, the legal system is not that. And I'm not criticizing the law. I'm saying it's logically incompatible. And I walk around like Spock from Star Trek, where I'm like, that's illogical, but that's illogical. And I'm kind of trying to give that gift to you as well. All right, so Hobbes' gift to us is get rid of the good. He would actually punish people for trying to talk about justice. So I have some other words there. Without law, we have no knowledge of the face of the earth. No account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, continual fear, danger of violent death, and the life of man is, does anyone know? Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. All right, so that's kind of fun. So virtue ethicists like Socrates, Augustine, Aquinas, they disagree about what is justice, but they were all aiming toward it. And Thomas Hobbes is basically, he's like sort of an innocent babe in the woods. He wasn't born rich, but by the time he was 3, he was translating Thucydides from the original Greek. So he was a very smart person. And he just basically tells us the same thing that Socrates tells us, which is the law is incompatible with justice. And then everyone got depressed. And when I say everyone, I mean the philosophers. They got depressed, and they're all scratching their heads, and they're like, well, maybe we can call a little bit of things good. Let's just, draw a tiny circle around what's good. Because, in a sense, I think they were a little bit persuaded by Thomas Hobbes. All right, which is not to say he's right. This doesn't mean that society is aimed at the good, right? So we have a quick digression about what was going on in society at the time that Hobbes and Rousseau and all these people were talking. We got colonialism, capitalism, and communism, which are three bad things in a sense, right? Like they cause their own problems. Colonialism is a disaster. You read just one page of, kind of summary, it's not good. Capitalism has its own problems, which is not necessarily that you should not be a capitalist, because actually communism has its own problems as well. The Holodomor is kind of interesting right now because this is a time where Stalin purposely starved millions of people to death because he's like, well, we just can't feed them, so we can't, and so they're like, okay, so communism is no good too. So we got all kind of problems. I got a little timeline there for you, just for your information. And in the U.S. Constitution, there's this weird aspect of it that I want you to think about the logic of what's in the Constitution. Because we separated powers, checks and balances, supremacy of the law. And so, is it a good that you have a Senate and a House? Is that somehow tied perfectly to some notion of virtue? It's just like they laid out this process, and they said, we think if you follow this process, you're going to lead to the least worst outcomes. It's basically the point of it. So the process is in the Constitution. Nobody said this is good. This is the definition of virtue in humanity, right? But is there anything in the U.S. Constitution that says this is good and we're not going to allow it to be subject to a process? That's one of the riddles for today. All right, so the rule of law was Hobbes' gift to us. And I would argue you wouldn't be in this class without it. And the question is why? All right. So here we go. The philosophers try to raise the sun. We got Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is, I argue, some of my friends, we get together and we argue. And one of the things we've argued about is who's the smartest philosopher of the first millennium? Everybody agrees, Aristotle. Who's the smartest in the second millennium? And I've argued it's Rousseau, although he's also the wrongest. So it's kind of, a little bit of a paradox there. But then it turns out there's this theory that a famous philosopher, a Native American philosopher named Kandiaronk, actually spoke to French elites and put the idea out there that Rousseau is given credit for. So in any case, it's kind of an interesting thing that possibly the smartest philosopher of the second millennium was Kandiaronk. It's kind of fun. So Rousseau says that before we recognized society, before we looked at another human being, and I'm going to look at you, and we see what another human being, how they're experiencing, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, do I have something on my hair? And suddenly we've lost all that joy and freedom. Like we just sit around and dance and have joy and not worry about that stuff. Rousseau says we had that, or he just wants to create a thought experiment of what would it be like if we didn't experience the gaze of another human being. And as soon as we do, we're like, it's like, wait a minute, I'm free. And they're free, and they can choose us or not choose us. And it's like suddenly we want to, look at ourselves in the mirror, become narcissistic, and suddenly we're all in chains. So without Rousseau, you've got no Kant, Nietzsche, Marx, all of these things who sort of have their basis in that spark of an idea that Rousseau puts out there. So Kant says, do not use another human being for your purposes. Do we see that in the world? Yeah, we see some pretty ugly examples of that. Mill says maybe we shouldn't subject half of society to slavery. You know what he might mean by that? Who is half of society? I don't know if y'all have seen the show Kunk on Earth, but she's hilarious. And she says, so in the 20th century, we discovered a new kind of man called a woman. And turns out they can do anything a man can do. So it's kind of funny. Anyway, you should look that up. It's kind of fun. Nietzsche is often credited with saying God is dead, right? He's complaining about the fact that God is dead. And who killed God? Thomas Hobbes killed God. And he's complaining about that. Now, Nietzsche is also a little bit evil. Kierkegaard's one of my favorites. He's the highest aim of humanity is faith in God. And maybe not everybody believes that, but let me just put it in your head for a moment. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to be religious and follow a strict moral code? You know, like somehow in society we've gotten used to disparaging religious people, but it's hard to be religious. All right, so how does this relate to the foundation of this class? Try to start separating what is good and what you wish the world looked like from what is. And here's some facts that you're welcome to disagree with. The good can be generated from what is. If I find out that such and such causes death, then suddenly maybe we should try to figure that out, right? Like medical doctors, they're just trying to make people better and make people not die, and they're all aimed toward that. Seems like it's kind of a, reasonable assumption. But what is should not be generated from what should be. And here's the problem. You see the world about the way it is through a lens of what you think it should be. And I'm just trying to create a little aperture that separates those two things. All right, so here's some riddles. There's a Google form you can fill out. Why is cooperation not a virtue? Why is justice so dangerous? And why would you not be in this course without the rule of law? All right. Now, let's start working on categorizing the claims. Because this is basically, your understanding of this is going to constitute your grade on the exam, plus your riddles and all the extra credit and all of that kind of thing. But you've got to sort of understand it at an intuitive level. So we're going to do lots of practice. We're going to practice today, and we're going to practice on Tuesday so that you can start getting a sense of the difference between these various kinds of claims. All right, but first, why am I doing this? Now, I'll tell you a story. The first 15 years I was a professor here, I allowed students to just rewrite essays over and over again, as many times as they wanted to improve their grade, okay? So, and I sat with students for hours talking about, okay, what's wrong with this claim? Why does this evidence not work? Why does this argument not work for this assignment? And really, I found that the most difficult thing to get students to unlearn basically comes down to the difference between a fact and an argument. And I was asking students to make arguments, but they are so used to, and it's not your fault. You've been sort of conditioned to learn facts and then tell the professor what you learned, right? Your whole life you've been doing that. Read the book, write a book report, right? And so the question is how to get out of that habit. In a sense, I would argue that intelligence is a habit. not an attribute that you hold. It's also not a virtue, but we'll talk about that later. So the question is why? And that's because in life and in your upper division courses, if you're still a freshman, sophomore, junior, this is kind of helping. Some of you are seniors, and it's like, ooh, that's a little bit too late. But you want to start getting a sense for making an argument that is not obviously true, right? And the more non-obvious it is, that is still defensible and has evidence, but the more non-obvious it is, the better. I mean, we just had somebody apply for a job a couple of years ago, and he came out and gave what's called a job talk, okay? And a job talk is, how do I put this? The worst experience of someone's, like, it's just terrible. You have to give your presentation of your own research for 45 minutes, and then you sit in a group of people whose job it is to rip you to shreds, okay? So, and that's what you have to do to get a job. And so people in that audience, which are other faculty who are voting on whether to, hire, somebody, people in the faculty have to be like, well, wow, I never thought of that. And that's a really good point. And if you get that, you get the job. So somebody came in and made an argument a couple years ago that could not be wrong, right? And if it cannot be wrong, it's a straw man argument. If you've got no counter argument, then it's not an argument at all. And I argue, look, he's probably smart. Like, maybe we should hire him anyway. And people are like, no, we're not going to hire somebody who says, something obvious, right? You've got to discover something that's not obvious. You got to challenge what people think. And I'm trying to give you a sense of what it means to know the difference between arguing something that's obvious and something that's non-obvious. But you still got to defend your non-obvious claim, right? There's examples where I'm reading an essay and I read the argument and I'm like, well, that's kind of stupid. But I keep on, maybe for a paragraph or two, and I'm like, oh, they're not going to argue through the obvious way. Then suddenly I'm interested. And I want to get you to be interested in reading stuff that you're likely to disagree with, right? That is, anytime I read something, it's like Rousseau, the wrongest political philosopher. I like what Rousseau makes me think about. I like what he challenges me to think about. And so there's some joy in that. And I get joy from learning from you. So I got to teach you how to teach me the things that you think that are non-obvious. All right. So you want to learn to write something worth reading, okay? It has to be able to be wrong. And we have a fancy word for that. If you've taken statistics, or you should take my statistics class, because there's no math in my statistics class, 0. All right, so just telling you that for fun. It has to be able to be wrong. It has to be falsifiable. So you put something out there that could be wrong, and then you try to prove it wrong. So one of the best compliments I got about my book, about the Supreme Court, somebody, is like some big fancy person in my field, wrote me a little note, and it said, I don't believe your theory. I don't believe it could possibly be correct. But I've never seen somebody try so hard to prove themselves wrong, right? So you want to be thinking all the ways, because then you're tending to what your reader might be objecting to. All right. And, one day you're going to write a note to your boss, and you're going to say, I think what you need to do is put a soft serve ice cream thing in the main office, and here's the reason. It's going to bring joy, and joy brings productivity, or whatever you're going to do in your life. You're going to be persuading people, right? You've got a college degree, or you will, and your job is then to have judgment about what you're arguing. All right, and we're paid to read your essays, but nobody else is in your life. And so we kind of want to give you something worth saying. So insights, inferences have counter-arguments. If it doesn't have a counter-argument, don't write the essay. I mean, unless your professor is asking for a summary, in which case, I don't know, shame on that? I don't know. Okay. All right. So, yeah, I didn't figure this out until I was late in undergraduate. I was like, oh, they want me to say what I think. It was like this, dawned on me at some point. All right, so each of the 5 kinds of claims that are inferences, that are actually arguments, have their own method of verification. They have their own, I shouldn't call it verification, I should call it, way to make validation. They have their own method of validation. And we call learning about these approaches methods classes. So among the faculty that say, well, what are you teaching this semester? Oh, I'm teaching methods, right? And methods means I'm teaching students how to make inferences, usually from data. All right, so verifiable observable are things that are not verifiably true, but you can verify that they're not true. They're facts that are generally known. They could be facts that need a citation. They could be tautologies where they cannot be wrong. The words in the text, if you could look up in the text and say, did Thomas Hobbes say there is no such thing as justice? You can point to the page and, it's not an interpretation. An interpretation of Hobbes is when you're making a non-obvious claim about what Hobbes said. All right, meaning of words in a dictionary. Those are all verifiable observables. All right, so what kind of argument? Oh, I already gave the answer. That was dumb. So arguments that are called arguments that are not really arguments are sort of straw man arguments. They have no counter argument, or you pretend to look at the counter argument and you characterize it as stupid or extreme, All right, so as in Minecraft, inferences are hidden, and some gems, I don't know if y'all play Minecraft, but my kids are whizzes, and I'm not very good, and they're like, oh, Mom. But I do know that there are some things that are good for some purposes, but don't help you with other purposes. And so it's kind of the same thing. So inferences are hidden. You don't want to make an argument like where you're walking around Minecraft and the stuff is just on the surface. No, everybody else can see the stuff that's on the surface. You want to dig and figure out, like, what is the evidence I can use to verify or to validate this claim? The only thing worth doing is how to make inferences. Memorizing observable, verifiable information is not really worth doing. I mean, we've inherited a form of education from a time before we had smartphones, computers, right? You had to know stuff because you couldn't just look it up at your fingertips. Now that you can look it up with your fingertips, we can go further with education and try to help you pull things together from the evidence that's available. All right, types of inferences. So we've got causal inferences. In causality, there's 2 kinds. There's the historic event. Now, historic event doesn't have to be from history. It could be today you're wondering, why do I have a stomach ache? That's an event. You're one person. You're wondering why you have a stomach ache. And you're kind of looking for clues, what I do yesterday, what I do this morning, right? You're looking for causality, but you're trying to explain one thing, right? You're not trying to explain why sometimes you have stomach ache and sometimes you don't, right? One time, a few years ago, I was going through a thing where suddenly I'd just have crippling back pain, and then it would go away. And then crippling back pain, and then it would go away, and then it would stay gone for months, and then it would come back for months, and what in the heck is going on? So finally, I created an Excel spreadsheet, and I started tracking every day what I was doing, what I wasn't doing, and I figured out that it was the supplements my mom told me to take, and I'm like, oh. And like, which ones are doing the job? I have no idea, but I just take them just in case. And so that's kind of trying to take a one-day event and turn it into a research question. What are all the things that I might be doing that were causing my lack of back pain to back pain? Right? Today it's a little bit bad, and so I would take note. And so, and basically what I did was I turned it into a general predictive causality. I was trying to predict my back pain from all the attributes of, like day 1, I worked out, day 2, I didn't work out, day 3, I ate this. I started tracking everything, looking at the various variables. And now, you know what I do? I take supplements. and back pain goes away, and I forget to, and it comes back. So I turned it into a research question. In a sense, social science, that's what we're doing, is general predictive causality. We're looking at data, and it could be qualitative data. In a sense, you can turn a lot of qualitative data into quantitative data, but you don't need to, right? I did this a little bit, I exercised a little bit. That's a qualitative data source. All right. Then we also do, members of people in the social sciences, we interpret. And there's 2 kinds of things we interpret. We interpret text. We look to see, what did Hobbes really mean when he said we should have, revolution is illegal unless it was successful, and then you can't go back, What does he mean by that? And then people will argue about what they mean by that. And they're not saying the obvious things that Hobbes says, which is there's no such thing as justice, right? But they're trying to dig a little deeper and teach each other things about what Hobbes really meant. We also interpret events, and this is the first time in this course I've dealt with this, because I really, I don't think we have very good ways of doing this kind of process, but we'll sort of like list a couple of events, and we'll say, well, that means this about society. Oh, well, now Hobbes brought us into a period of enlightenment. So it's like, what does that mean? Are we still in it? I don't know. Like it always turns on the definition of the word. And the reason I've included it is because I found a work that actually does it well. And so we'll be reading that. So now I'm kind of including that. And I'm also including it so that when people are arguing what something means, it often kind of turns on the definition of the word, and then you realize you're arguing about different things. You're like, well, I like capitalism. And the person says, oh, you like harming people? And, and you're like, no, I just, and so people will argue about that. Political scientists do this kind of stuff too. And then we do normative inferences. Now, ethicists in the philosophy department are very good at normative inferences. And has anyone ever been told, you got to avoid the normative? Has anyone ever been told that? Okay. Social scientists will often tell you that. They'll give you that advice, but then you're like, well, how do I do that? And basically the advice is to stay in your lane. When you're arguing about what something should be, you've got to have a first principle. Like, what is my bottom line thing that I care about? It could be biblical fundamentalism. It could be the pursuit of property. It could be rights and liberties. It could be political equality. It could be utilitarianism. I have a little recommended reading that kind of lists some of these things out so you can kind of figure out, well, what is my first principle? And in my constitutional law class, I have an assignment where I ask them to not make an argument that defends some particular constitutional policy. We should not allow hate speech. We should allow hate speech. We should have money in politics. We should not have money in politics. But I don't ask them to make the argument. I ask them to find a non-obvious first principle that is logically connected to that specific proposition. And the reason I have that assignment is because, first of all, when people start making normative arguments about what should be, they get so passionate and they start, and you get illogical. And I do too. I mean, it's human, like our brains aren't super well wired to keep these arguments separate, so that's part of the problem. But the other problem is that when you're trying to convince somebody, I really think you should be pro-life, right? And you're talking to somebody who's pro-choice, you got to figure out where they are, what their first principle is, and make an argument that pro-life is connected to property or something like that, right? Or, I don't know, freedom, I don't know, something like that. And so I want people to kind of get that skill, because you want to be making non-obvious normative arguments sometimes, and you've made them all your life. Every time you try to convince your parent, like my kids, Mom, can I have 500 Robux, or whatever? And I'm like, all right, tell me what what are you going to do? Negotiate with me or whatever. Well, I'll tell you what I could do for you. And I'm like, oh, okay, now I'm interested, right? And so we do this all the time. We're trying to convince everybody, but I can give you tools to do that well, to kind of go through a process. Like, what is another person's first principle? And there are plenty of first principles that are perfectly acceptable first principles that are not mine, right? But I can talk to people who have different first principles if I've had that practice. Okay, so where are we? Great. So I am trying to, in a sense, I was going to say brainwash, but somebody said that has a bad connotation. But in a sense, I'm trying to kind of wash your brain of the constant barrage of arguments that mix and match these different things. So in a sense, students walk into my classroom and they'll say, well, there's two kinds of things. There's facts and opinions. And which one's better? Facts, they're better than opinions. Opinions, you just, whatever. And usually when we use the word opinion, we mean normative opinion. Like you're a Democrat, so you like such and such kind of policies or whatever, right? We usually think in that way. But causal opinions are also opinions. They can be validated, but not perfectly. Now to help you pass exam 1. So we're going to define the claims. First, we want to talk a little bit about intersubjectivity. And I hate fancy words, but I don't know another word for this. So intersubjectivity is I can say there are 209 students in this class. And you're like, all right, that might be true. And you could go look it up and see how many students in the class. But if I told you there's 25, you could verify that that's not true, right, in a sense, right? So it's sort of like that. Conservatives and liberals can both investigate what causes people to support higher taxes without agreeing on whether we should have higher taxes or not, right? Some people investigate what causes people to support war because they support war. And they can have causal opinions that are validated by the data that could be agreed upon by somebody who's anti-war, right? All right, so we can agree that about Dobbs that it got rid of the right to abortion, right? It sent it to the states. We can all look at Dobbs and agree on that fact without agreeing about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, right? So it's intersubjectivity and text analysis. All right, so normative arguments are arguments that reveal what your values are. They're statements of opinion that come from your values, or they reveal your values. There was one point in my book where the editor wrote me and they said, you used the word appropriate here, and that seemed to have a normative bias there, and I was like, oh, I can't believe I made that mistake. And I was like, clearly we got to get rid of that. If the person's values are directly stated, then you've got a normative bias there. Now, if I tell you that Roe versus Wade caused the decline of crime that we saw in the 1990s, you might say, I think that person likes Roe versus Wade, right? But literally the words that are coming out of my mouth have nothing to do with whether I like it or not, right? I'm just making a causal argument. I'm presenting that idea. And I bet there's not one pro-life person in this room that if you bought into the evidence that it actually caused the decline of crime, that you'd be convinced, right? Causality is not dispositive of your ethics. It doesn't prove something that's wrong with your ethics. You could believe something's good even if it causes something bad. And you could believe something's bad even though it causes something good, all right? So just kind of keep that separate. All right, text interpretation are statements that have to do when somebody's interpreting a text in a way that is non-obvious and also that has a counter-argument. So I give an assignment in my constitutional law class. Last time I taught it, the students mutinied because they were like, it's too hard. And I was like, that's too hard. Law school is going to be really hard. But I said, find a passage that can be interpreted in two ways. That's it. That's all you have to do. You don't have to say which one's right. You just have to find something that could be interpreted in two ways. And so we'll be doing a little bit of that with Griswold. Griswold is just rich. It's a case that decided we have the right to use contraception. And it's just rich with, you could interpret it in multiple ways. So it's kind of fun. So the meaning of events attaches word or phrases to certain events. It describes things. It's almost never done well. And yet we do this often. I mean, when we call things like World War II is terrible, it's like, it's pretty true. Everyone, can kind of get on board with that. But you violate intersubjectivity when you use your own ethical values and bring that into the way you're interpreting the words. That is a violation of intersubjectivity. You're not going to convince a judge, to tell a judge, well, you've got to follow that previous case law. And the judge says, why? And then you say, because it's not fair. And the judge is automatically going to, I don't care what you think is right. You've got to actually be a fair judge of what the case law is saying. All right, so it's a logical fallacy. So some political science that does this, a party's in decline. A lot of political scientists kind of do that kind of thing. And I'm like, I don't know what decline means. So, so I have trouble with this. Do institutions matter? What does that mean, matter? Like, do they cause X or do they cause Y? Was January 6th an insurrection? That is a claim about what's being made, right? Is it an insurrection or is it not? Is a question of interpretation. All right, so general predictive causality. Conservatism of the public, sometimes the public's more conservative, sometimes it's more liberal, causes the outcomes at the Supreme Court. It causes the liberalism or conservatism of the decisions that are made by the Supreme Court. You can test that causal claim, okay? They must be falsifiable, but causal claims are tested by looking at the data. And we can measure the liberalism of the public versus conservatism of the public. And we can measure the liberalism of the Supreme Court and the conservatism of the Supreme Court. And so it's usually something that varies across units. So here we have level of education on the x-axis, political tolerance on the y-axis. And we talk about education causing political tolerance. The dots in that graph are people. And there are a lot of people. It's not just one person. It's not saying, well, why is Professor Baird politically tolerant or not, right? It's not asking why I'm that way. It's trying to, and so you could also talk about pollution levels across counties and death rates from COVID. People have looked at that. The dots are counties. And here's another one. You could talk about military deaths per capita. And the dots in there, an average support for the president. The dots in there are months. January 1988, there's such and such number of people dying from war. There's also a percentage support for the president. And we can look at that and we can test that causal claim. All right, but if you have high education and high political tolerance, you can't test that, right? There's a lot of things that could lead you to believe, well, I don't really like neo-Nazis, but I don't really want government to decide whether they should be allowed to protest or not, right? You might, but who knows why you are that way? Or you might be here, or you've got your weird friend from high school who decided not to go to college, but is somehow like, I think we should always allow freedom of protest, and right? Why are they like that? You can't really test that hypothesis. Or you've got your weird aunt. And maybe one day you'll be the weird aunt. I'm probably a weird aunt in my life. All right, so there's going to be a question. Does liberalism of the Supreme Court, did that cause them to uphold Obamacare? Right? That's event causality. But conservatism of nominating presidents affects the ideology of the Supreme Court justice that they ultimately pick. Levels of saturated fat causes an increased probability of getting heart disease. That's general predictive causality. Verifiable observables. All right, we got 2 minutes. They're often facts, but they also might be false. But what you've got to get a sense of is this verifiable? You don't need to know whether it's true, the statement. You just need to know, could everybody look at the fact and see with their own eyes that it's true? Or does it have to be true by definition? All right, so they may not be true. All right. So each kind of claim can be mistaken for a verifiable observable. And when I've asked my students to write essays to make an argument, and they give me a summary that is a paraphrasing of the text, or some summary of things that are true, that's confusing the difference between an argument and a fact. So we've got Booth killed Lincoln in the theater as a verifiable observation. You could also say Booth's gun caused Lincoln's death, and it would still be verifiable observable. It's not causality. All right, white supremacy caused Lincoln's death. If you look at the evidence, there's some good reason to believe that. But white supremacy causes people to want to murder presidents, right? That's more general predictive. People who daydream about murder also fantasize about murder, because daydream and fantasize are the same thing. That's a tautology. It's true by definition. All right. Normative statements that everybody would agree with are sort of verifiable. Like, how about we not torture people to death? And everyone's like, that sounds good. And so kind of be attuned to the difference between what is a verifiable observable and these other forms of inferences. That's a good practice.